Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the third session of the Journey of Healing training series titled Understanding Trauma and Decolonizing Trauma. My name is Aaliyah Smith Gomes, and I am a project coordinator at the National Council of Urban Indian Health, also known as NCUIH. Joining me from the NCUIH team are Maddie Curry, the Public Health Program Manager, and Amy Lord, who is our Senior Communications Associate. We are honored to have you all here. We kindly ask that you place your name, organization, tribal affiliation, and job title in the chat box. In addition, we welcome any feedback you would like to provide about your webinar experience in our survey, which is posted in the chat box as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. As we dive into our session, here are a few things to keep in mind. This session is being recorded. All mics have been muted unless otherwise directed. Questions can be typed into the chat box, and a Q&A will follow at the end of this session. Next slide, please. As shown on the agenda, our presenters will provide a detailed presentation of the impacts of historical trauma within the AIAN community and how that is being overcome today. We will end the session with a Q&A, a survey reminder, and upcoming opportunities at NCUIH. Next slide, please. To provide a little background on us, the National Council of Urban Indian Health is the national nonprofit organization devoted to the support and development of quality, accessible, and culturally competent health and public health services for American Indians and Alaska Natives living in urban areas. NCUIH is the only national representative of the 41 Title V urban Indian organizations under the Indian Health Service and the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act. NCUIH strives to improve the health of over 70% of the AIAN population that lives in urban areas, supported by quality healthcare centers. Next slide, please. This activity is jointly provided by NCUIH and CARDIA Services. CARDIA Services is approved as a provider of nursing continuing professional development by the Montana Nurses Association, an accredited approver with distinction by the American Nurses Credentialing Centers Commission on Accreditation. This program is approved by the National Association of Social Workers for 1.5 continuing education contact hours. Next slide, please. Upon successful completion of this activity, 1.5 contact hours will be awarded. The successful completion of this continuing education activity includes the following: attending the entire CE activity, completing the online evaluation, submitting an online CE request, and your certificate will be sent via email. And if you have any questions about this activity, please contact Fiona Morrison-Fleming at CARDIA. Next slide, please. We also want to take a moment to recognize that addressing the historical trauma of Native communities is an incredibly sensitive topic that might affect some participants today more than others. If you find yourself impacted by today's discussion, please connect with your support networks or reach out to NCUIH and we can provide you with the healing resources. Next slide, please. We will now introduce our wonderful presenters. First, we have Jennifer Nunez. Jennifer currently serves as a lecturer with the University of New Mexico, Division of Community Behavioral Health in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Health Services. Ms. Nunez has been in the social work and education field for over 25 years with experience working across tribal, urban Indian, federal, and university systems, all with an emphasis on serving the American Indian population. Next, we have Teresa Gomes. Teresa is a faculty member of the University of New Mexico Division of Community Behavioral Health Services. As a lecturer, Teresa has dedicated her career to serving tribes and advocating for issues affecting American Indians. Teresa has worked extensively with tribal governments and various governmental agencies at the federal, state, and local levels. She has been instrumental in building and strengthening tribal-state relations in collaboration. And finally, we have Dr. Deidre Yellowhair. Dr. Yellowhair is currently an assistant professor in the research faculty in the Division of Community Behavioral Health in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Health Sciences at the University of New Mexico. Dr. Yellowhair is also the current chair of the Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility Committee and the project director for the Trauma-Informed to Build Resilient Indigenous Balanced Communities Enhanced with Strength, or also known as the T.R.I.B.E.S project, that focuses on raising the standard of care and improving access to services for traumatized children, their families, and communities of American Indian and Alaska Native communities throughout the U.S. We will now turn it over to the UNM team for their presentation. Thank you, everyone.
Hello, good morning, everyone. It is very nice to be here with all of you today with my colleagues, Jennifer and Dr. Yellowhair. We'll go ahead and get started with the presentation, and we'll obviously throughout the presentation, we will be watching for questions in the chat. But if you have a question, if you could raise your hand or just unmute and ask the question, we'll be taking turns, not only presenting, but monitoring. So if you can advance the next slide. So the learning objectives for today's presentation on understanding trauma and decolonizing trauma are listed here. You'll be able to examine and understand the foundations of trauma studies, examine and understand the foundations of population trauma and historical trauma, and finally, understand, examine, and decolonize the work and treatment via the cultural safety model. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jennifer to start us with the presentation.
Hi, next slide, please. So good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. Thank you for having us. When we originally were asked to present on this particular topic and our title and our objectives, it challenged us to think about this idea of trauma, in part because it's one thing to talk about decolonizing trauma work and trauma treatment and prevention. It's another to think about how do we identify and decolonize trauma itself. And so we started from that aspect here. So one thing when we think about trauma is that trauma events have been in existence really, of course, since time immemorial. There's always, unfortunately, been trauma across the globe in all of our communities in every space at some point in time. And in part because of that, we also know that trauma responses have been in existence for that same period. But when we think about trauma studies and how we've begun to study trauma and really thinking about trauma response and the ways we approach treatment with trauma, that has been developed only fairly recently. And that history dates back actually to the late 19th century in early psychoanalytic theory. So you may be familiar with terms like shell shock or battle fatigue, and these were early terms used to describe trauma reactions, especially for our military population coming out from the Civil War and later in World War I and in World War II. But what was interesting is that originally these were viewed as personal or moral shortcomings in their response, meaning that the individuals themselves were experiencing shell shock or battle fatigue in part because of their own character, not because of their trauma. And so later treatment recommendations regarding this early phase of examining treatment really just included rest, as well as, again, thinking about moral character. We also can turn to Freud's early work with women and hypnosis that began to uncover trauma histories. But we know that Freud later deviated from this theory and moved into the theory of his psychoanalytic approach. And again, we know Freud's theory was very much based on this understanding that trauma and these stories were not real, but he assumed that they were made up in part of the psyche. So these early works within trauma were the first forays in really understanding what trauma is, what trauma impacts are, and how they affect people, but again, very much from an individual lens. So let's move forward here. Next slide. So as we noted, this early work really did focus on the individual, and it was created from that Western perspective or Western lens. And the definitions that came regarding trauma often reflected that same view. So we're going to talk about that here in just a moment. What this early work neglected was to examine trauma directed to populations, or trauma that was inflicted upon populations across generations or spans of time. So that very early work was very much focused just on individuals and not populations, despite the fact that we know we were already seeing, again, populations like our American Indian populations, our African American and Black relatives also experiencing trauma at a population level and across, again, generations. So let's move to the next slide. So let's look at trauma as a definition and thinking about how even it's defined even to the present day. So individual trauma is an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning, well-being, mental, physical, social, and spiritual well-being overall. And we derive this particular definition from SAMHSA. This is the trauma definition out there by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Now, we also see trauma defined by other agencies and folks a bit differently. So the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, who we're partners with on our T.R.I.B.E.S project, defines trauma as a frightening or dangerous or violent event experienced or witnessed that is threatening to a child's life or body integrity. Again, in part because of their focus on children's trauma, is defined from that child's perspective. They also go into to know about adversity, because we know part of trauma can come from adversity, and adversity is something that we also see out there impacting our populations. But this is a broader term to describe serious hardship or misfortune that requires significant adaptation by a child in terms of psychological, social, and neurodevelopmental systems. There's a big word. And I need more coffee. And are outside the normal expected environment and may or may not be a traumatic event. So we can have traumas and we can have adversity, but adversity doesn't necessarily equal trauma. So we can examine all of these different types of trauma that we see here listed: physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical and emotional neglect, school violence, natural and human-caused disasters, military-related stressors. All of these different types of trauma really still remain primarily individual focused, not necessarily population focused. And so that's the challenge when we think about trauma. Next slide. Additionally, when we think about types of trauma, we see them broken down into two different types: single incident trauma and chronic or complex or developmental trauma. So a single incident can be in short duration, high intensity. Chronic, complex, or developmental trauma can be multiple type, chronic or prolonged exposure to a trauma over the course of a lifespan. But it's typically interpersonal in nature and the intensity can vary. Now, what's interesting about both of these definitions and even these types of trauma, again, is that it still fails to think about how we think about populations experiencing trauma as a whole. And so this is the next part of our discussion here. Now, Deidre's going to talk a little bit about ACEs here in a moment, and also talk about how ACEs still tends to come from that individual experience. So Deidre, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you for, go ahead, next slide. Thank you for defining how we have come to understand and know trauma from that Western perspective. And we're going to talk a little bit about adverse childhood experiences and examples of ACEs, and how trauma impacts the brain a little bit from that Westernized perspective, because again, in decolonizing the understanding of what trauma is, we first have to look at what is out there. So many of us are familiar with this pyramid, the adverse childhood experiences and ACEs. And when we look at this, it really comes from that deficit model in looking at what an individual may lack, what is impaired, what is disordered, what is pathologized. But like my colleague expressed, it is that very individualistic approach. And even when they think about ACEs in terms of what ACEs can be experienced from that familial perspective, it focuses on that Westernized notion of what an immediate biological family looks like, and doesn't take into account the extended family, or the way that families and tribal communities form families from that cultural perspective, and include tribal, cultural, ceremonial kinship systems that exist within our tribal communities that are really often a strength in our families and communities. But again, these models tend to be very deficit focused in what individuals and even individual nuclear families lack or have as a dysfunction. And even if you look at the pyramid, as you look up, it's based on adversity, impairment, health risk, disease, disability, problems. And at the very pinnacle of the pyramid is that idea of early death. And that really is in conflict with many of the cultural understandings and teachings of what happens during an individual or a family lifespan. Go ahead and go to the next slide. We know that research has shown that exposure to adverse childhood experiences does have adverse impact and long-term physical and mental changes. Children can experience long-term changes in their behavior, in their mental health, and even their cognitive functioning. Here's a more updated version of what types of child adversities and trauma types there are, and this is collected by our partners, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, or NCTSN. And again, they expand some of those ideas of what trauma may look like, what trauma exposure might look like for individuals and family, to include things like natural disaster or forced displacement, extreme interpersonal violence, bullying, physical assault, war, terrorism, political violence. They highlight things that are coming up now in present day that may have a traumatic impact on children as they witness it either in the media firsthand, or they hear parents or caregivers, teachers talking about these things. But again, what we want to draw attention to is that even with this expansion, it still lacks that cultural context of how tribal communities really understand child development or lifespan development, and it lacks that cultural context of the family and community and the cultural connections we have within those communities and families. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So now that we've covered a little bit about ACEs and what trauma is, we want to talk a little bit about how we've come to understand how trauma impacts the brain. We know that a certain amount of stress is actually pretty helpful for healthy development. Making sure that we have the capacity from childhood through adulthood to think critically and learn new skills and apply new skills to difficult or challenging situations can be helpful for not just our emotional development, but overall healthy brain functioning. However, when you are under chronic stress or chronic neglect, or you're experiencing chronic ACEs in childhood, that really impacts the development of your brain, and it doesn't give you the opportunity, doesn't give children the opportunity to really develop the capacity to rein in their emotional responses, their reactivity. So we tend to see kids who have strong emotional reactions. And even though the prefrontal cortex doesn't fully develop until early 20s, we see children who come from a trauma background exhibit and demonstrate an overreactive or impulsive prefrontal cortex, because their thinking brain, that part of the brain that helps regulate emotion and brings down the cortisol in toxic stress situations, that part is underdeveloped. So frequent and prolonged exposure to stress really has an impact on the way the brain functions. So we really want to highlight, not only does trauma and ACEs have an impact on the way that children behave or the way they interact, but it really does have an impact on the development of the brain. Go ahead and go to the next slide. When we talk about trauma, we talk about the ways that it shows up and manifests in behaviors. Here highlighted are the different ways that trauma can present itself and show up. Many of us are familiar with some of these symptoms. It's important to pay attention to some of these symptoms because they can be, the symptoms can show up in other diagnoses, but we do want to highlight that these are some that are very common among children and in intergenerational trauma. So that sense of loss of interest in activities that they typically enjoy, irritability, agitation, anger, numbness, dissociation, physical arousal, blunted affect, being emotionally overwhelmed, exhibiting panic attacks, hypervigilance or a hyper startle response, intrusive thoughts or intrusive memories, feeling hopelessness over being able to control the way these symptoms manifest and show up, or where they manifest and show up. Imagine being a kid and having to always be on edge, even in a classroom where you should feel safe, and how that impacts your ability to learn when you're in your emotional brain and not really in your thinking or responsive brain, but you're really reacting to situations. So we do want to take a moment to highlight trauma responses and again focus on the individuality of how trauma is understood and things and how we react. If you want to go to the next slide. I briefly want to talk about how we think of colonialization as trauma. You know, trauma in the American Indian and Alaskan Native communities is pretty extensive, and there are lots of examples throughout history, across history, that demonstrate how colonial influence and colonialization has impacted individuals, families, and communities through legislation, policy, and procedures that were not made for us, by us, to benefit us. And this is highlighted in systems of genocide, forced removal, relocation. We can take a look at it, any timeline of history, and highlight different examples of how colonialization has traumatized individuals, families, and communities throughout the tribal nations across the US. if you want to go to the next slide, which brings us to the seminal work of Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart. In the mid-1980s, Dr. Braveheart really helped to define and conceptualize the concept and the model of historical trauma. And this came from observations from a grassroots perspective on what was happening in tribal communities, particularly what she was experiencing during her time as a graduate student. If you go to the next slide. Her experiences were really the impetus for her study and her ongoing work. And she really defined historical trauma as the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations emanating from massive group trauma. Many times what is left out when people talk about historical trauma or when other academics talk about historical trauma is that piece of it includes the lifespan. What that means is that it is everything historical, intergenerational up to a minute ago, because everything up to a minute ago impacts the way that we interact with each other, with our families, with different systems, with systems of academia, judicial systems, with legislation, how we understand our positionality in the universe. So that is one thing that is often left out of the definition of historical trauma. Historical trauma isn't something that happened generations ago. It is ongoing. And those historical trauma features or responses, next page or next slide, the historical trauma response features similar to some of the symptoms that we just explored. But this here, these constellation of symptoms that can come up when historical trauma responses are activated, those can be activated in present day. So when we see things like images from the wars that are going on globally, when we hear of other oppressed communities experiencing oppression, some of these symptoms can come up in us as American Indians and Native Alaskans, because we know what it feels like to empathize with the plight of others, and how history, how policy, how legislation, how governments that are beyond individual control can really impact us from an individual, family, and community level. So it's really important that we deconstruct that idea that trauma and trauma responses are an individual experience, but really are experiences that we navigate with our families and with our greater community at times. I'm going to turn the time back over to Jen.
So as we think about historical trauma, so Terrell writes that historical trauma theory helps us look at this, and my apologies, next slide, from a macro level, meaning that it gives us that big view of what historical trauma or trauma to a population can do, and how it can affect the life course, not only of individuals, but really of a population as a whole. And so when we see that exposure to trauma at a particular point in time and compare that with unexposed populations, then what we see is that change happen for populations who have that exposure. So mass trauma, when we think about mass trauma, when we think about this historical trauma, mass trauma is deliberate and it's systematically inflicted. And that's the difference when we talk about this type of trauma. And trauma is not limited to this just single catastrophic event, but it continues over an extended period of time. And these events can reverberate throughout our population. So we see that impact happening. We see that potential in epigenetics, for example. And that magnitude of that trauma can derail a population. It can knock us off our balance, in part because as whole people, our whole beings, our whole worldview, our whole communities are being challenged by this trauma that's being deliberately inflicted. So historical trauma really helps give us the language around that. And that's why, again, Dr. Braveheart's work is so important, in part because it helps us to understand how do we convey that history, and how do we convey that deliberate trauma experience that we've been through as a population? How do we convey the experience and the response over time, across lifespans and across generations. And it helps us to conceptualize those impacts that we see even today. So next slide. But when we think about trauma treatment and trauma treatment out there, again, in the Western world, our world that we live in right now, we see there's treatments like cognitive behavioral therapy, cognitive processing, prolonged exposure, EMDR, narrative therapy, and of course, even medication management. These are still predominantly focused on the individual and the individual response. It's not focusing on the broader experience of this trauma as a whole for a population. Next slide. Now, one of the steps forward that we do see kind of in Western culture or overall dominant culture is this idea of trauma-informed care. And we're not knocking trauma-informed care. We like trauma-informed care. And trauma-informed care does come through with an approach that assumes that everyone, no matter who they may be, where they come from, what population they come from, what community they're from, they may have had some type of trauma experience. And trauma-informed care really seeks to create systems of care that are responsive to that. And again, of course, adhere to what we call the 4 R's, realizing that trauma is widespread, recognizes trauma and the associated trauma responses, responds to that trauma by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into things like policy, procedure, and practices, and of course seeks to actively resist re-traumatization. And so trauma-informed care is a good step forward in that framework of thinking about how do we work with folks across the board who may have had, again, trauma. Now, again, what it still does not necessarily take into consideration fully, even though it is a tenet, is, again, those historical issues. So I'm going to turn it over to Teresa. My apologies, I jumped on your slide. This next slide is yours.
Thank you for that, Jennifer. I really appreciate it. You can move to the next slide. What we're going to do in the next couple of, or what I'm going to do in the next couple of slides is really to take a quick look at the CDC's Office of Public Health Preparedness and Response. And this is also in collaboration with SAMHSA's National Center for Trauma-Informed Care. And I think the point that I want to make here is that, as you can see, it appears to be a very linear process. In fact, it's not. We have to keep coming back to each of these components as we think about trauma-informed care and trauma-informed approach, because these don't happen in order, okay? But these are absolutely the 6 areas that we want to pay close attention to. And so this is really how SAMHSA defines the trauma-informed approach. But as you've heard from Dr. Yellowhair and from Jennifer, is that in tribal communities and in tribal ways, that it's really, this is an area that we have been practicing for generations, quite frankly. Dr. Yellowhair talked about kinship, Jennifer, and populations. Jennifer has talked about populations and communities as a whole. And so thinking about how we bring the trauma-informed care, it's really a tribal practice when you think about it. This is the way science, and no knocking science either, we're all for science, but this is the way science is defining this. And again, thinking about number 4, that collaboration and mutuality, and you see there several individuals there. But, thinking about a community approach, peer support, helping one another. And again, thinking about that community collaborations, and also that kinship approach. Thinking about the populations approach. And so we can move to the next slide and just spend a minute or two thinking and looking a little more closely at those 6 domains of safety, and thinking about your organization, organizations that see individuals, and also thinking about how our organization is structured and the way that we're looking at treatment approaches. And so thinking about, throughout the organization, the staff and the people that they serve, that people feel very physically safe and also psychologically safe. Trustworthiness and transparency. Again, organizational operations and decisions are conducted with transparency and with that goal to build and maintain trust. Very important to build and maintain trust. Peer support and mutual self-help. I'm not going to read all of these. You will have access to the slides, but I did want to highlight that again, thinking about all of these tenets and these domains, is that collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and cultural, historical, and gender issues are all principles within the trauma-informed approach and framework. And always looking at these aspects as to how we are functioning, not only as an organization, but how we are relating to one another, and also how we are relating to the people that we serve. Next slide is back to Jennifer.
So when we think about, again, trauma-informed systems, it still kind of butts up against the language that's utilized in our mental health practices. Mental health practices overall, again, in terms of this model of Western approaches, still focuses on disorders, dis-ease, right? And our focus is on diagnosis and treatment plans. We're working to fix something, identify pathways to fix an issue or a problem. And then we often hear about like terms like compliance, like we may have clients or patients who are non-compliant. And again, when we think about trauma-informed language, this definitely doesn't comport with a trauma-informed system. So even those language and labels can be very problematic. And we know that they're very inherent in the system, and we really have to work to change that, again, because language should also be matching along with that trauma-informed response. So again, thinking about labels that we often see: defiant, defensive, oppositional, combative, even this idea of frequent flyers as opposed to someone who's coming to get their needs met. Again, we're having to really challenge that language. The other piece too is that we often have to think about evidence-based practices are developed by the mental health industrial complex, meaning that this whole system of care over time has been westernized, medicalized, and of course operationalized to be a money-making effort in many instances. And while yes, we need the funding to support those services, we again then see frameworks like evidence-based practice being imposed across the board, and these evidence-based practice models not ever necessarily been developed by the populations that they serve or are targeted to. So that is again the challenge when we think about not just trauma-informed systems, but again, as we're coming into this space of decolonizing trauma and trauma work, that we have to think critically about and begin to work on deconstructing these practices in a way. Now, I will say really quickly, we're not arguing against evidence-based practice overall, but what we do need to think about is where are these evidence-based practice models normed? How are they developed? Who are they developed for and with? What involvement in the communities that they're targeting has been part of that process. And so again, Karina Walters' work that we'll touch on here in just a moment really speaks to that. So let's go on here just really quickly again. Next slide. We're revisiting that idea of colonization as trauma. And one of the current constructs of trauma is it continues to create this colonial subject who requires intervention, support, and saving. That's what's so interesting about colonization overall, is that there's this assumption that we're not meeting a standard that's been set by this other group. And so colonization now assumes that we as a population have issues, have challenges that we need to be changed, right? And the focus on trauma is still on that individual health problem. It prevents that more critical, historically situated focus on social problems that are part of that neo-colonial state and that contribute to violence and harm. Long story short, and really summarizing this, what this means is that colonization creates these systems and these structures that often exacerbate trauma in our community, create access issues within our communities that again contribute to trauma overall. So policy and procedure and policy processes have been and continue to be central to the colonization of Indigenous people locally and globally. So this is why we really need to look at systems overall. So Teresa's going to talk a little bit about, again, historical oppression and the social determinants of health. Next slide.
Yes, thank you, Jennifer. And also, you know, a little bit more on this issue around historical oppression is that historical trauma doesn't actually fully explain the pervasive and the chronic oppression that Indigenous populations continue to experience. We continue to, in some cases, live on reservations within these confines of, you know, rules around that come down from the federal government on you know, on other things. And so we also, again, thinking about this concept of historical trauma, described as the chronic, pervasive, and intergenerational experiences of oppression that over time may be normalized. They are imposed and internalized. That's really important, is that we tend to then internalize into our daily lives and how we interact with not only our families, our communities, but the other populations that we encounter. And so historical oppression really includes both not only the historical, but the contemporary forms of oppression. So next slide. So thinking about decolonizing trauma work and really thinking, looking at it through equity and social determinants of health, you know, we really want to focus in on these, our environments, our physical environment, but also just the societies that we live in. What is, when we think about social determinants of health, we're really thinking also about our economic security, our access to supportive educational systems, stable housing. Do we have it or are we without? Stable neighborhoods, physical, our physical environments. What do our neighborhoods look like? What do our surroundings look like? What is our physical everyday environment? You know, there's a lot of work around food security, or in the converse, food insecurity, and how is that affecting, you know, our daily lives, our supportive communities and social contexts, and of course, really important to emphasize this access to healthcare systems. We know that across the board, that access to healthcare systems is a tremendous determinant of how we take care of ourselves, how we can or cannot. And Dr. Yellowhair, I see you.
Oh, sorry, I unmuted myself and jumped the gun because I have the next slide.
Okay. All right, so next slide is again a little bit more around the social determinants of health and the contributing factors to colonial trauma. You know, we really want to structural violence and structural racism is increasingly understood in populations and public health as a major determinant of the, you know, really the distribution, and then of course the outcomes of social inequities. And so when we think about structural violence, it's again, as I mentioned in the last slide, looking at the whole and not looking at one factor as the end all be all, but looking at economic, political, legal, religious, and cultural groups and societies that may be stopping or hindering individuals and societies from reaching their full potential. It's encompassing historical timelines, all of those policies that have been imposed or determined without really thinking about the impact of populations, and also thinking about institutional betrayals and abuses that populations have experienced over time. It really helps us to define the context, you know, the full context in which these inequities can occur, but they also give us some ideas and some areas that we can work on. Once we recognize within the full context, then we can really start working on shifting those models to more of a strengths-based, using strengths-based and trauma-informed approaches. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Yellowhair.
Great. Thank you for that. We want to really spend a little bit of time talking a little bit about the impact of structural violence, because to highlight how policy and procedures, even at an organizational level, next slide, please, even at the organizational community level, structural violence has really had an impact on the way that the reality and experience of American Indian, Alaskan Native communities has been pathologized and weaponized in a way to determine dysfunction or disorder or unhealthy behaviors, unhealthy physical health, and really has created this disruption in the harmony and the way that individuals really view holistic health that extends beyond the self and extends to the family and community. So it's really interesting. I have had conversations with others who've said, historical trauma really should be in the DSM. We need to make it a diagnosis. And that's something that we would really advocate not to do, because historical trauma in its pure definition and its intention was not meant to weaponize or pathologize the experiences of American Indian populations or populations that have experienced mass group trauma that they had no control over, but were determined by structures of government, policy, education, healthcare systems that were really created not for us, by us, to benefit us, but they were created by them for us to assimilate us. And that's really important in understanding how structural violence uses those uses things like the socially constructed notion of race to create disorder and disharmony in pathology in communities and individuals from, again, that very narrow individualistic perspective. If you want to go to the next slide. So it's really important that we extend and go beyond that individual level and really start to look at the bigger picture. When you look at the bigger picture and begin to understand how structural violence has really had an impact in shaping the way that we understand mental health and how we talk about mental health in a disordered fashion versus the strength-based approaches, when we interview and we think about motivational interviewing, it a lot of times more closely aligns with some of our tribal practices because you're opening up for a discussion. You're allowing a client to be the expert in their own experience, and you're drawing out what are their strengths, what are they already doing that is working, and how can we maximize on those strengths to propel them to that next step in making changes that can help them benefit from a healthier livelihood. And we let them make those determinations versus us imposing on them what we believe they should be doing. But it comes from that motivational interviewing and having that open dialogue with individuals we work with. We talk about this and we talk about APA and how APA uses that system to perpetuate harm, but it's not limited to APA. It's not limited to the American Psychological Association. It's inclusive of social work, education systems, doctors, dentists, optometrists, gynecology. We can put any X, Y, and Z and say that they've helped in perpetuating this structural violence. So go ahead to the next slide. Structural violence also, Teresa touched on this a little bit about how when we don't have the infrastructure to support what our communities need, there's a lack of resources. And many of our communities are in rural areas. When I think about New Mexico alone and how much travel and time is required for our community members to have access to doctors, nurses, dentists, have access to clean water, or have access to fresh food and grocery. Mental health is not very high on that priority list when you have to brainstorm and try to strategize how you're going to get fresh water, fresh food, if you have enough gas money or gas in the tank to get you to the gas station to access your doctor, primary care physician. And then you get there and you realize that because your area is so rural, your primary care physician moved to another IHS facility or another opportunity that has access to a better quality of life for them, not thinking about the community or the members that they're leaving behind. And then you start all over having to build rapport and new relationships with new providers, and how taxing that can be on anyone's, not just physical health, but their mental health, their relational health, and how much distrust that can build within communities and structures like academic systems, healthcare systems, judicial systems, that, where it takes a lot of time to build rapport and community. I'm going to go ahead and turn the time back over to Jen.
Thank you for that, Deidre. And again, thinking about this structural violence and the systems over time that have perpetuated this violence against us, and again, through systems of approach, systems of treatment. And then again, the systems that, again, as Deidre mentioned, that have created these distances, these lack of access, these hoops that we have to jump through, are also forms of structural violence. And in all of these approaches and all of these systems and all of these spaces, none of them take into account our Indigenous view of health. So next slide, please. And really our Indigenous population as a whole. So how do we view health? Well, I love Dr. Kahedi and again, Greenwood and Lindsay's comment around Indigenous health views. And so they describe it as relational, collective, familial, intergenerational. Our health is anchored in identity, in our culture, including historical and traditional knowledge, our languages, our ceremonies, our traditions, our beliefs, our stories, our art. And it's tied to the land and an environment, and it's based in our core cultural values of what it means to take care of each other and promote our cultural perpetuity overall. And so in all of these spaces, again, none of these approaches, even within trauma-informed care, does it take into account fully this Indigenous view of health. And it doesn't center this view of health as primary, and where these systems, again, should be originating for work within our communities. So this is why we really love this idea of cultural safety. In the next slide, please. So some of our work that we've been doing recently around, again, it started actually with COVID response and thinking about how do we help folks who are coming into our communities really understand all of this framework. And during that time, we came across this concept of cultural safety. Now, it has yet to be really picked up in the United States, but I will say that actually says a lot when we think about colonial systems and structures within the US. But this particular concept is an Indigenous model. It's developed by a Maori nurse researcher, Ramsden. And what she was writing about, seeing this interaction of these systems with her people and her population, is that it was, again, not recognizing that worldview, not taking into account our view of health, our experience. And so she wrote that Maori people no longer accept that our world is a perspective on the reality of anyone else, meaning that our reality is just as valid. We have our own whole, viable, legitimate reality, and we're not just a perspective. So what this means essentially is that it's not being weighed against the dominant culture. The dominant culture cannot create us as a perspective. Oh, that's your thinking. That's how you're experiencing things. This is reality. No, our reality is our reality. And when she was thinking about healthcare services, she writes that this leads to the question of choices in service delivery. The data on Maori mortality and morbidity and empirical evidence has made it quite clear. The health service is not and has not ever been culturally safe for Maori people. And she writes, the service has not been designed to fit the people. The people have been required to fit the service. Does that sound familiar? We've been made to fit within these systems of healthcare, of treatment services, even within trauma-informed systems that don't necessarily attend to our population or historical trauma. And that's the challenge that we have to consider. So let's take a look really quickly at the next slide, that definition. So what is cultural safety? Well, it's an outcome based on respectful engagement that recognizes this history, those power imbalances created by colonial systems. And it lets safety be defined by those of us who are receiving care, not by those who are providing it. So again, thinking about policy and procedure development, systems and organizations, oftentimes they're creating these structures without involving the population that they're going to serve, and not creating it in response to that population and the needs of those populations. So what we see right now in the US is the big buzzword has been around cultural humility. And again, these steps that we've taken across time, cultural awareness, cultural sensitivity. And for a long time, we were stuck in cultural competence. But cultural humility has been the most recent step within the US to say we need to look at those power imbalances. But it's still very much on that individual interaction. We had a great conversation with a wonderful new colleague yesterday who also said, and it seems to put the burden back on the patient to be explanatory, to share with them all of their knowledge. And that's exactly what we're, again, trying to avoid in some way, is that additional burden on us in trying to access safe care. Systems should already be consulting with us in the development of those processes to create systems that are culturally safe for us. So let's go back here now to this next slide. We talked about those 4 R's of trauma-informed care. Well, cultural safety adds to those. And what they say is that in culturally safe systems, part of those R's should also, again, include regenerate and revive. That our goal as partners and collaborators in patient or population care is to encourage and support our own Indigenous populations framework and engagement in our local healing practices, our own framework, our own worldview. In that regenerate and revive component looks at that from a resilience-based framework. And again, lets it be centered in our Indigenous worldview. And that's what cultural safety, again, promotes. So let's move to the next slide here. So when we think about approaches, again, a reminder that when we've examined evidence-based practices that are currently out there in the world in that we experience, many times those have not been normed or developed for us. And Karina Walters and several of her colleagues write that when we think about Native health interventions that are based on non-Native EBPs, they're only looking at quantifying the frequency of a particular, cultural practice. How often are we engaging language? How often maybe are we engaging some type of cultural practice in the actual approach, without looking at that underlying mechanism of that approach itself? What is it about language learning? What is it about traditional practices? What is it about taking part that is actually the foundation for that behavior change? Not the number of times we do it, but that actual engagement in that. So what they do is when that happens is they're ignoring that epistemological foundation that frames Native cultural practice. So what essentially she's saying is simply indigenizing an approach is not enough. We need to come from that perspective in full. So we must simultaneously decolonize as we indigenize interventions. Next slide. So she goes on to write about, well, how do we examine those and how can we actually evaluate interventions that are coming from this culturally based focus? What does it follow or need to follow to be centered in that space? So does it incorporate our original instructions, as she writes, what our stories and teachings are from our communities? Does it focus on nurturing relational restoration? Is it examining those worldviews across body, place, self, family, community, past generations, future generations? Is it allowing us to advance our narrative, and is it giving us this space for embodied transformation? Meaning, are we involving our whole being and thinking about the way we talk about our histories, our stories, and express that even through our bodies? And of course, coming back to research, does it incorporate Indigenous community-based participatory research approaches? That's the framework that they've created to really examine approaches and how we can develop them from really a culturally safe perspective. So really quick, Deidre is going to take on this piece around Rides at the Door in Shaw as an example of that. Deidre?
Wait, go ahead and go to the next slide. When we think about those community-based approaches, or when we think about decolonizing while indigenizing, it really is important to think about some of that for who, by who, to benefit who. what healing practices are being utilized, by whom are they being utilized, and is it effective for a certain population? What is important about this work in decolonizing trauma and indigenizing treatment or interventions is the recognition that we are the evidence. We are the evidence that our cultural practices work. Because in our review of what historical trauma is, in our review of the Westernized perspective of trauma, ACEs, structural violence, systemic racism, determinants of health, all of that, despite all the policy, all the legislation, all the procedures, all the structures that have really been imposed on our communities and our people, we are still here. Our languages still endure. Our cultural practices are still here. And in many of our tribal communities, they're being revitalized. So we need to validate that for our families, our individuals, and our communities, that those strength-based approaches that they are utilizing that are informed by practices that have been here for generations, for many of us, stories that begin with the dawn of time, that we are the evidence that those practices are effective. And when we look and when we take a bigger look at some of the ways that we talk about trauma-informed care, those pillars of trauma-informed care really are inherent in our cultural teachings, in our cultural knowledge. We create that space of safety for our children. We create that transparency. We want to honor history and gender, and we want to have collaboration and peer support. All of those things are inherent in our tribal communities already. So it's so important that we take away from this, not just what institutions or organizations, systems of care, psychologists, social workers do, but how they implement these practices and interventions to honor that cultural space and that contextualization, that culture is important and really is a vital way that we exist in this world. Go ahead and go to the next slide. You know, we talk about all of this from that resilience perspective. We often talk about historical trauma. We also, as a community, have historical resilience, that cumulative emotional resilience across generations that include the lifespan, and that is what keeps our traditions, our culture, and our languages alive. There are different types of resilience within our tribal communities. There's that physical resilience that helps us endure. There are practices throughout our communities, like in my community, the Diné Nation, it's running. Running is a sign of physical and mental endurance and resilience. There's spiritual resilience. There are ways that our spiritual practices have endured over time and have taken on that challenging task of being formidable and resilient against policy, legislation, and things that could have disrupted or interrupted the harmony of our spiritual practices. There's emotional, psychological resilience, and there's transformative resilience, the ability to acknowledge the world that we exist in today and transform. And you know, we often hear people talking about we walk in two worlds. We walk in one. Our reality is the one world we walk in, and we translate between the westernized world and our traditional tribal worlds. And we bring that together to uplift ourselves, our community, and our families through those cultural and traditional healings. Go ahead and go to the next slide. We want to leave you with this because we started looking at the westernized approach to understanding ACEs. This pyramid was published and created by Rides at the Door and Shaw in 2023. But if you take a look at this and the words that are used and really the pinnacle of the pyramid, that meaningful life of longevity, it really does reflect the way that our tribal communities conceptualize life and the importance of life within our children, within our families, and within our communities. But in order to have that meaningful life of longevity, our communities and families need to get away from this colonized idea of trauma, but really look within our communities itself at the bigger picture and think about how we provide opportunities for intergenerational healing, honor tribal sovereignty. We support cultural revitalization and traditional healing practices to help our communities be safe and thrive. When we have thriving, safe communities, our children and families have positive experiences throughout the community. When that is established, there can be consistent corrective experiences that help with cultural identity development within our children, our young adults, our elderly, all throughout the lifespan. That really helps to foster cultural values and coping skills that are healthy and based in our culture. That brings us wellness and balance, providing us that meaningful life of longevity. So when we reframe and decolonize the idea that trauma is an individual experience, even if it happens to us, to an individual, we still have a family that we have reciprocal relationships with. We still have a community that we are tied to and connected to. So an individual trauma really extends beyond ourselves because we come from those tribal practices that are not individualistic, but are communal. And what impacts us impacts our family. What impacts our family impacts our community. So I believe we have time for questions.
Yes, thank you. If anyone would like to ask a question or if they have a comment about today's presentation, feel free to turn our camera off if you're comfortable with it. I see David. David, go ahead.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all for putting all of this together. It's really, really useful to know. Taking back a little bit of what Deidre said earlier about not mentioning, or maybe I misunderstood that part, but she did say something about not mentioning or trying to stay away from mentioning the historical trauma that has been. I think it is important to address the historical trauma so people today can understand the factors and the consequences of all the negative things that happened after the colonization took place here in this continent. And in my mind, I draw a parallel between what happened to our Native American groups, how they were displaced, how they were robbed of their culture, of their language, of their land, and what's happening in the South when a certain demographic of people are having basically mass amputations because for some reason, for some medical insurance companies, it's easier to deal with the consequence than with the education of, hey, let's make sure that you don't get diabetic in the first place. Let's make sure that you do have a proper education about what the dietary guidelines should be, so you don't end up being in a place later on where your foot or your entire leg needs to be amputated. So to me, that kind of draws a parallel. And please correct me if I'm mistaken. I'm still learning. And thank you.
Thank you for that, David, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to clarify. I would never encourage anyone to ignore historical trauma or historical events that create and perpetuate trauma. What I meant was historical trauma as a concept and model should not be in a DSM because it is not a diagnosis. It is not created to pathologize or further stigmatize the history, the consequences of historical practices, legislation, and interactions with systemic oppression. So that may have been where the confusion is. It is not a way to, historical trauma is not a way to stigmatize or weaponize the experiences and realities of how history has created massive oppression for groups of people and how that oppression has manifested.
I agree 100%, Deidre. And can you remind me again what DSM stands for? Sorry.
It's the Diagnostic Statistical Manual that psychologists, social workers, and psychiatrists use to provide mental health diagnosis.
Awesome. Thank you very much for your time.
And Mr. Durham, so if I can also add to that conversation really quickly with your example, say, of diabetes care. Again, going back to a conversation we were having yesterday with another colleague, thinking about diabetes and the rates of diabetes, say, in our tribal communities, it's in part because of these historic oppression, this historical trauma. And so beyond just saying we need to educate you regarding the nutritional, needs that you may have, and we just need you to eat better. Oftentimes we have to examine, but do they have access to those systems? Do they have access to foods? Do they have economic stability to be able to do that? And we see those challenges within our communities. So oftentimes our populations are interacting with healthcare systems that are saying, go exercise and eat better, but their environment may not be safe to do so, nor may they have the income level to attain that food, and that food may be 40, 50 miles from their house, 60 miles an hour drive, that they may not be able to go get regularly. And so this is why, again, thinking about these systems of care, this overarching history, social determinants of health, and even this idea of cultural safety really has to drive our systems here forward, because these current systems do not do a good job of that. And we work within a university healthcare system, and we see that, and it's something we're trying to change as well. But our population is interacting with these systems that were never built for them and do not take into account these histories. And that's the challenge, because then it becomes that view of the person is the problem. The person isn't complying. The patient isn't adhering, right? When in truth, it's all of these access issues, these challenges, and the system creation that exacerbates that.
You're absolutely right. Nothing we do telling people what's healthy and what's not healthy to eat if they live in a desert food, in a desert area food, where they don't have access to fresh produce or fruits or things that are not so processed. And yeah, you're absolutely right. Nothing we do, we are just sharing the information, but not making sure that they do have access to what eventually will make them healthier and not needing the amputation.
Yes.
And maybe even shifting the conversation to what are some of their more traditional foods, not commodity foods, not government issued food, but what did they have access to? There's, wild parsley, wild onions. There are ways that that communities can get sustenance. And one of the things, to add to some of what Jennifer said, is people don't realize that there are still tribal communities that don't have access to running water or electricity. So having perishable foods is not an option.
And if I could also add to the conversation, is that we ourselves need to talk about and decolonize using the language that is not imposed on us, and starting off presentations with, yes, we recognize that there are issues with substance use in our communities, but we also have a whole population of people within our communities that don't have substance use disorders, or may not have diabetes. And so when we're presenting, we're talking, and we're looking at systems, is that, we've been programmed in a way, because in some respects, because of the way the systems are designed, when we're looking for grant funding, we're asked first, the first question is, what's the need, what's the problem? And so in really thinking about our own language, is how are we framing the conversations with not only these funding entities, but also within our own healthcare systems.
Thank you.
Thank you, David, for the question and the conversation. Does anyone else have any questions? Feel free to place your questions in the chat or come off mute. Either or is fine for us. The floor is open.
I'm gonna chime in here really quick too, because
Mhm.
going back to Teresa's point and wrapping kind of all of this together, that's again going back to these systems and that structural violence, because in nowhere do they support systems that are working well, right? And especially when it comes to funding and grant support, once our communities are beginning to really thrive and do well, oftentimes we see that federal funding go away because, oh, we need to give another community a chance to do this. Yes, we understand that. But at the same time, now it eliminates that access again to funding to support those systems that are working well. And so that's when we talk about this structural violence that continues. We're still subject to that. So how do we begin to really push against systems and really create culturally safe spaces from the ground level up the best we can and really challenge even agencies and federal systems about that space? So again, we really need to be changing hearts and minds everywhere and think about this framework truly of cultural safety and how we can create culturally safe spaces for all of our people. And while it's indigenous in its basis, one of the things that we know that what good for indigenous people is good for everybody. And if we can again create those systems that keep our frameworks in mind, in truth, it's going to benefit everyone that interacts with those systems. So we want to thank you for letting us be here with you today and walking through this kind of very complex topic of decolonizing trauma. But again, this is something that we need to be actively working on a daily basis. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for that point, for adding that point, Jennifer. You have some comments from David and Linda and Amy in the chat box. And if anyone else doesn't have any other questions, we're coming up on time, so we'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. And yeah, thank you, Amy. Oh, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for this important session on MMIP prevention. We appreciate any feedback you would like to provide about your experience today. Please complete our session survey by using your phone to scan the QR code on the slide or by clicking the link that will be placed in the chat box, which Maddie has done. If you have any questions, please feel free to email myself or Maddie Curry or the wonderful woman that we had present today. Next slide, please. NCUIH is also hosting many upcoming events that we would love for you all to attend. These events include data sharing and data use from an urban Indian perspective, which will be held on May 23rd. Infection prevention and control practices, addressing blood exposure, which will be May 29th. Unveiling strategies into behavioral health financing, a collaborative review, which will be held on May 30th. And we have our prevention perspectives, substance misuse and overdose among urban Native populations, which will be on June 5th. And if you scan that barcode, you can come up, it'll pull up other NCUIH events that we will be hosting as well. Next slide, please. And as a reminder, the Technical Assistance and Research Center, or also known as TARC, provides individualized technical assistance training and support to UIO. So feel free to reach out if you have any technical assistance needs that we can assist with. Next slide, please. And again, thank you so much for joining this important session. Any feedback you would like to provide about your webinar experience, please do not hesitate to complete our session survey. Thank you again for attending, and we hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you so much, everyone.